We left off last time with the guy who did all the research about smoking and became the world expert. And then when he was under stress, he ended up smoking. And the purpose of that fictional story was essentially to illustrate that that's exactly, that story might be fiction, but the application is fact in all of our lives. Because all of us have our stated values and our lived values. We have our things that we understand, and we understand them sometimes so well that we can lecture to other people about them, and somehow they don't cross the threshold between what we know and how we behave. One of my favorite lines is that in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is. And that's exactly the point. We can become so absorbed with theory, and then we don't know how to cross over from the things that we know to the things that we live, from the things we understand to the things that we practice. So really what that means is we've discussed in our journey through the Spheros, we've discussed the concept of Keser, of Chokhmah, and of Bina. So we said that Keser is really outside of and beyond and drives the entire system of the Spheros. And Chokhmah and Bina so far are the two first energies, so to speak, that Hashem invests into his creation, where Chokhmah is very abstract or ethereal or sublime and temporary, but very powerful and inspiring all at the same time. Whereas Bina is more developed and more, it's got greater depth, it's more profound, and it's a long-term experience. But we said in human experience, remember, we keep going back and forth. The way Hashem has designed us is that we look at our own operating system, and that gives us insight into the divine operating system. So we keep going back and forth between how things are in the big system, the great world in which we live, as well as how they are in our own personal experience. Okay, so that kind of the back and forth. So right now we're talking about our own experience, where we get stuck. We get stuck in the translation of theoretical ideas into real lived values. So we ended off last time with this fellow who goes and has the smoke after giving his whole presentation about the dangers of smoking. And we said he's got all the bina in the world. In fact, he has more bina, he has greater understanding of the facts than more than any other person in the whole medical fraternity. So what's he missing? So we started off, where we left off last time by saying that he's missing something called da'as. Now, da'as is a big topic. How do I know that da'as is a big topic? Because the word da'as appears more than once right at the beginning of the story of humanity. The obvious is of humanity. So the obvious place where da'as appears is Eitz Hada'as. That's the most obvious, right? Eitz Hada'as, the tree of knowledge. And the other place is V'ha'adam yoda es chava ishtoi, that the Torah is euphemistic in telling us that Adam and Eve were intimate. So it says that Adam knew his wife. So those are the two times right early on in the story of humanity where we've got this word da'as. But I want to throw out one or two other places where we have the expression or the concept of da'as. This is a little bit more in the halachic arena rather than in the biblical arena. Here's a great one. And you can go home afterwards and tease your family about this, okay? So what happens? People wash their hands for bread. So normally if you're having a meal on your own, it's not a big deal. You wash your hands, you say the bracha, you eat the bread. It's not hard. But when you have a crowd, like for example on Shabbos, a whole lot of people, and some people have washed, and other people are waiting, and everybody's sitting around the table waiting to be able to say Hamoitzi, then everybody knows that while you're waiting to say the bracha over the bread, what may you not do? Talk. Okay, so we're going to debunk that. That is not accurate. The fact that people tell you that you may not talk after you've washed your hands, before you say Hamoitzi, is not accurate. It's not accurate in two ways. First of all, the halacha is absolutely crystal clear that, let's say, for argument's sake, you come to the table and there is no knife with which to cut the bread, then you are allowed to say, bring a knife. Now that's talking, and it's acceptable. But on the other hand, here's the part that you can tease your family about. On the other hand, this whole well, you may as well talk. Even though you haven't said the words, you haven't spoken, but effectively it does what you're not supposed to do. So, what are you not supposed to do between washing and eating hamotzi? What are you not supposed to do?
Talk about something not to do.
No, it's not talk. The problem is not talking. What are you not supposed to do? There's a good one. Do anything. So, for example, can you wash for bread knowing that there's another 10 people who's still going to wash? So now you're going to prepare a salad while you are waiting because you've washed. Right? Are you allowed to do that? No. Why not? So what are you not allowed to do between washing and saying Amoitzi? What are you not allowed to do? That's it. You're not allowed to have what we call Hesech Hada'as, which means, in simple English, to be distracted from the fact that you're going to be having Hamoitzi. So, distraction could be talking, distraction could be not talking, but doing something which takes your attention off the bread. It could be leaving the room. That could be problematic. Okay, it's not a halacha class. You'll go to whichever halacha shir it is, and you'll go. But the point I'm making is, Hesech ha-da'as. There the word da'as is used. And there da'as does not mean information. It doesn't mean knowledge. What are we saying? That if you're going to not have knowledge of having bread? No, that's not what we're saying. So how are we translating da'as in that context? Very interesting, right? So attention, is that really the translation of the word da'as? I don't know. Let's hold that thought and perhaps we'll come back to it at some point. Here's another one. By the way, I'm just going to throw this in on the Hesach HaDa'as concept. So now that we understand that Hesach HaDa'as is being distracted from the bread, then you can also know that the Gemara tells us that there are three things that come beHesach HaDa'as, which come when you're distracted. One is the sting of a scorpion. One is a metzia. A metzia literally means when you find cash lying in the road, but we colloquially also use it when you come across a bargain. You say, I found a metzia. By definition, it's not a metzia if you knew it was coming. And the third is Mashiach. It says Mashiach will come with Hesach HaDa'as. So people believe, that means the Mashiach can't come if we're going to pay attention, because Hesach HaDa'as means distraction. So this is a very interesting concept in its own right. The other place where we have the concept of da'as is katan ein boy da'as, that a person who is not yet old enough to be considered an adult in Jewish law is not considered to have da'as. Now, does that mean that children cannot have knowledge? There are some really smart kids out there, and many of those children in certain areas have more knowledge than we do. So what does the Gemara mean when it says katan ein boy da'as, that a child does not have da'as? Clearly, da'as is not as simple as just saying knowledge, which very often people confuse with information. So if we want to understand what da'as is, and this is part of the fun of Jewish learning, there's no straight line from a question to an answer in Jewish learning. You've noticed this? So either you're going to be rebuffed with another question, so you ask a question, you get a question in response, or we use an expression, which is, if you want to understand that, first you need to have context. Right? In Chabad Hasidus, you very often have the expression that says, "Ulohavin zeh yesh lahaktim." If you want to understand this, first we have to preface another concept. Because depth of understanding requires not just a snappy answer, it requires a full-blown context. And that's exactly what we're going to do over here. Before we can answer what this elusive element of intellectual development called da'as is, first we have to pause a moment and say, hang on. So far, we have described intellectual processes, chokhmah and bina. And we'd like to now describe the next intellectual process called da'as. But before we can do that, we have to have, for one moment, a brief bird's eye view of the whole system. Now, at this point, we haven't done that, right? At this point, we've just been developing the system step by step by step by step. But to be able to really get an appreciation of da'as, we're going to have a bird's eye view of the whole system. Now, if you do, in fact, still have the handouts that we had at the beginning of this series, so you will see that you've got the first three, chokhmah, bina, and da'as, are in a little block. And that block is called what? Right? What's it called? It's called, Abba refers specifically to chokhmah. So what is that block called? It's called intellect. It's called, we in Hebrew call it moichin, which is actually a plural word for brain. Moyach is the brain, moichin, the brains. Because we're implying that there are different aspects of intellectual process that happen. Okay? And then you've got the next 6, which is chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, hod, and yesod. They belong to a block which we call midos. Until we have some kind of an understanding of what midos are, we can't really get to what da'as is. That's why we've got to kind of step forward to be able to come back to see context. And very often that's the case. You've got to have big picture so that you can then drill down back into the details. Because if you don't see how everything is supposed to flow, then you don't really understand what's coming next. So in order to do this, we have to use human experience because it's closer for us, it's more accessible to us, it's understandable to us. So let's use human experience. Today we're going to focus on the difference between moichin and midos. So before we can get to the specific das, which is where we need to get to, the next of the 10 sephiros, we have to speak just generically about the difference between moichin and midos. Now, moichin I've translated. Moichin is intellect, or in the plural, intellectual processes. And out of those intellectual processes, we've already identified 2 of them, chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah is the innovative process, and bina is the exploratory process. And both of them are critical. We said you have to have the 2, they have to work in tandem, because if one tries to exist without the other, it won't be able to be sustainable. What are midos? How would you translate midos? And big disclaimer, whatever you're going to say is not going to be right. Okay, so how would you translate midos? Don't look at the book. I want to know what you think. How would you translate midos?
Measurements.
Oh, there you go. So what are midos? Midos are measurements. Can you imagine saying that a human being is comprised of intellect and measurements? What on earth do we mean by that? Other than the fact that this might be offensive to some people. What do you care about my measurements? That's between me and my doctor, right? It's like that person who comes to check in at the airline counter. And the check-in agent says to them, "You're overweight." And they say, "Yes, I know now." "Well, you just processed my suitcases, So leave my measurements out of this. Okay, so what do we mean? What do we mean? Why? So again, how would you translate midos?
I just think that it means that you've got to be able to balance.
Before you say what it means, how do we translate it? How do we translate midos? Or how do you define? What are midos? Behavior. Midos are not behaviors. Okay? They're not. This is really important. What we're made up of, but although that could just be a little bit too generic, because we are also made up of intellect. What do you say? No, midos are not actions. Definitely not actions. What we choose sounds closer to actions, right? It's not action. It's not behaviors. Attributes. There we go. That's a good word. So the best way to translate midos would be either attributes or characteristics. Okay, either attributes or characteristics. Now, when we speak about people and we say colloquially, this person has good midos, what do we mean? We mean they have good characteristics. They have good attributes. That's what we mean. That is what we mean. But we're going to be more clinical in our assessment, and we're going to say, okay, so now what are the classical attributes that people might have? Now, obviously, there are many, 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 but let's try to work out what are the classical attributes that people might have. If you had to group people by attributes, you'll say there are those kinds of people and those kinds of people. So let's try to be a little bit generic over here and talk about, I don't know, what are the classical attributes?
Honesty.
Soft. What do you say?
Honesty.
Honest. What else? Patient. Kind. Okay, so in Torah, when we analyze people, we group some of those characteristics under a single umbrella. So for example, if you're going to speak about patient or kind or soft, they'll all belong to a generic category that we say people of chesed. That's the term that we'll use. That's the midah, the attribute that becomes tolerance and patience and generosity and kindness and softness. All of that fits under the umbrella chesed. Okay? And so we'll go. We've got the 6. You've got it on the handout over there. I'm not going to go into all 6. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is a midah is a collective term for a series of characteristics that fall under a particular brand. Okay, so we're going to pull one of them out. I'm going to pull one of them out and just use it as our testing ground. So which one are we going to pull out? We're going to pull out, well, seeing as you've mentioned already, let's talk about chesed, which, by the way, it really falls under a category called ahava. That's really where it belongs, right? And love. So, like, for example, Avraham, who's the paragon of kindness, the Torah calls him Avraham Oihavi. He's the one who loves me, right? So his attribute is primarily love. Fine. So let's talk about that for a second. What is the difference between, using love as an example, what is the difference or the differences between intellect and attributes? So if I use chesed as an example of an attribute that a person has, what is the difference between the theory of chesed, the intellect, and the experience of chesed, the attribute? Let's try and understand this because it will help us get to what the big difference is between moichin and midos. So can you think of anything that would illustrate the difference between how chesed lives or how love lives in the mind versus how love or chesed lives as an attribute?
So people can say, I love you, but they don't show it.
Okay, so there's a great example. So people can say that they love you without showing it. Does that mean that the love they experience is intellectual, or is it possible that they actually feel and experience the love even without showing it? It is possible. So that's not a distinction between moichin and midos, because it is possible for people to have a strong attribute without having either the ability or the opportunity to turn it into action. That's not the distinction we're looking for. So what's the distinction between moichin and midos, between the intellectual realm and the realm of attributes?
So if you see a beggar, you can choose, do I want to give him tzedakah or don't I want to give him?
Okay, so good, great example. Unfortunately, an example we live with on a daily basis. So you stop at the corner and there is a beggar who comes up to you in your car and says they haven't eaten anything today, right? Now you have a decision to make. Do you give them or don't you give them? Does that decision reflect on which attribute you have? Meaning, if a person today has a spare sandwich in the car and gives it to them, does that mean that they have more chesed than yesterday when they didn't have the sandwich in the car and so they couldn't give it to them? Okay, so actions and behaviors don't necessarily tell the full story of whether a person has an attribute or not.
What happens if this person then puts in the car purposely?
Good, great. So here's the person who prepares themselves, right? They've got the little box of little food packs that they give out. What does that tell us about that person? Tells us. Does it tell us that they're very kind? Does it tell us that they're... I would debate that. Does it tell us that they're very kind? I'm going to say not necessarily. It tells me they're very organized. They're organized. Many people are kind, but disorganized. Many people have conscience, but disorganized. This person's strength is organization, not necessarily kindness. Yes, they, people are not one-dimensional, so they are kind and organized, but I don't know that their primary attribute is kindness. Maybe their primary attribute is organization, right? So it's difficult to be able to assess a person's attributes based on the small glimpse of behaviors that we get.
But attributes
So-
not be a consistent, permanent part of...
Not necessarily. An attribute can be a consistent part of a person's makeup without being a consistent part of a person's life, which happens, right? Okay, so...
What happens if somebody automatically, automatically puts his hand in the air?
Fine. So what does that tell me? That tells me a person is disorganized because they don't, and undisciplined.
No, I'm saying that...
I'm saying chesed is very beautiful and by nature often very undisciplined. We'll get there. When we get to chesed, we'll unpack that in a lot of detail. But for now, what we're trying to distinguish is between the intellectual and the attribute. What is the intellect? So we're using chesed as an example. What is the difference between the intellectual version of chesed and the attribute of chesed? And that's just an example. We'll apply across the board to all of them. But let's try and understand it. And so far we haven't got it. So let's try and work out what's the difference between the intellectual concept of chesed and the attribute of chesed.
Maybe you get taught what chesed is when you're sitting in a classroom.
Great. So, exactly. No, don't even say that. Don't say it's not application, because that makes it sound negative. Leave that part out. Let's just say there is the intellectual concept of chesed. It exists. Chesed exists as an idea. Let's not talk about how people apply it. We'll get there. But first we have to recognize that chesed exists as a concept. And in our case, we say that olam chesed yiboneh. Not only does chesed exist as a concept, it actually exists as the underpinning concept of all of creation. Because we say Hashem created a world of chesed, of kindness. So, but the point is that there is the concept of chesed, which exists in books or teachings or philosophy, the ideal of chesed. Now I want to ask you, in this room right now, I'm absolutely certain that there have to be at least a dozen different ways to express chesed. Has to be. So sitting in the room, let's just say, I'm going out on a limb over here, but sitting in the room, there are the people who, for them, chesed is that every person you see, you give them eye contact, you smile at them, you ask them, how's your day? Somebody else in the room, chesed is, you stop at the corner, there's somebody looking for a handout, and you've got your 2 Rand coins in a little packet so you can give them, or your packages of food. Somebody else, your chesed is that you always host people. You're constantly hosting people, even when it's inconvenient. Somebody else, the chesed is that anytime there's a meal chain, or there's somebody who needs help with shopping or with lifts, you're the first in line to do it. Now, who's right? There's no right. There's no concept of right over here. This is personal. This is personal. The attribute is personal. But they all fall into the ideal of chesed. So the concept of chesed is not personal. The concept of chesed is an ideal. Let's look at it from a very different perspective. Let's say that I took a light and I shone that light through a prism. And now I've got a rainbow. Which color of the rainbow is correct? It's a weird question, right? It's a weird question. What do you mean, which color is correct? What do you mean? They all came from the same source of light. It's the refraction of that same light beam. There's no such thing as a color of the rainbow that isn't correct. But is indigo the same color as violet? No. So it is possible that the same ideal, while it is still correct, can express in a way that is completely different to another equally valid way of expressing the same ideal. Make sense? So, what's the difference between moichin and midos? Moichin is the part of me that processes the objectivity of an ideal or a concept or a philosophy or an instruction. And the midos are the way I, as an individual, respond to it, or process it, or filter it. Okay? So again, so moichin is the objective appreciation of a concept, or an ideal, or whatever the case is. And the midos are my personal interpretation. No, interpretation is a bad word. My personal expression of that ideal. Because interpretation might land up with a different ideal, right? But it's my personal expression of that ideal. Does it make sense?
Yes.
So, somebody gets up in shul and says, now is the time that we have to have ahavas chinam, because it's the time coming up to Tisha B'Av, and we know that destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was because there was sinas chinam, because there was baseless hatred, and therefore our response is we have to have ahavas chinam, we have to have baseless love. Everybody in the room subscribes to that ideal. Of course, makes a lot of sense. Ahavas chinam, it makes sense. What each person is going to, forget about do, we're not at the do point yet, but what each person is going to feel that means to them is going to be personal. So, what's the most effective way to impact or influence, touch or inspire people? Intellect or midos?
It's becoming more impactful.
Let's put it this way, yeah?
It's not like it could be the intellectual because you also have to take into account what that person needs. So your personal understanding of maybe applying what you think they need, maybe the objective is to look what the other person needs, and that could also.
Okay, fair point. So let me tell you an interesting story. The Gemara tells a story. Gemara tells a story that there were two rabbis. Sounds almost like a joke, right? Two rabbis walk into a town. It's literally how the story goes. Gemara in Soita, right? Two rabbis walk into a town, and they both give a shiur. The one guy packs out the hall, and the other has a trickle of students. So the one who had the trickle of students was feeling a little bit shemzach, he was feeling a little bit uncomfortable that everybody else went to the other shiur. He didn't want to say anything to his colleague, but he was a little bit conscious of the fact that everybody went to the other shiur. What was the difference between the two shiurim? So the first rabbi gave a shiur in what the Gemara calls shmaitasa, which means straight, black and white halacha. And the other rabbi gave a shiur in agadata, which are the beautiful drushes and insights and stories and personal application. Who do you think got the biggest shiur?
The second one.
Of course, without a question. I could tell you for a fact that having given one or two shiurim, if you want to give a shiur and you want a crowd, doesn't matter what the shiur is about. Just use a title that sounds like it's going to be whatever people need in their lives. So for example, one of the most, I don't know if you know this, one of the two most popular topics out of all topics that rabbis ever speak about, what are the two topics that always bring the most people through the door? You don't know? Relationships. And why do bad things happen to good people? And many people say it's the same topic. Right? So
I think it's interesting the way you phrase, the title of the shiur is determined based on what the people need in their lives.
yes.
So essentially what the rabbi is doing is he's tapping into what the people need and he's giving what the people need.
Right.
So I'm saying just in terms of like the
No, exactly.
today,
Exactly.
the Vedas
Versus Moichin. So let's take it back to the story in the Gemara. So the rabbi is giving the shiur about Shmaitza gets a small crowd. The rabbi is giving the Agadata shiur is getting a massive crowd. So the rabbi who got the smaller crowds doesn't want to say anything, but he's feeling very uncomfortable. So the other rabbi says to him, you know what the difference is? Imagine two merchants came to town. One of them was selling high-level diamonds. And the other one was selling kitchen appliances, basic kitchen appliances. In those days, he used the word sitkivs, which is like needlework. Who's going to get more customers? So simply what's he saying? What's he telling him? That Agadata is the cheap version of Judaism and Halacha is the expensive version of Judaism. It's like only for the elite. What's he telling him? What's he telling him? So he's talking about sitkis, right? Like these little needlework things. What's he telling him? The job of a needle is to connect things. When you speak about what connects with people relate to that. It makes sense, it resonates, talks to me. Halacha, not everybody resonates, especially if the halacha that you're learning may not be applicable in the common circumstance, in the modern era, right? For example, if somebody had to get up and say, we're going to do a halacha shiur about bringing karbonos. We should be learning that. We should be learning it. Right? It's very clear in Torah that we have an obligation to learn the halachas of those mitzvahs we cannot perform. But who's streaming through the door to hear the technicalities of how you check your sheep for a mum, and then bring it. But if somebody had to get up and say, we're going to learn the secret of avoiding anxiety and stress. Aha! There you go. The place is going to be full. Why? So this is the difference between moichin and midos. The advantage of moichin is that it allows us to assess things in their truth. We haven't yet applied a personal bias. The disadvantage of moichin is it's not personal. So in order for a person to grow and develop, the greatest challenge is the transferring of what I know to be true to what I feel to be personal. And until a person knows how to do that, we could have all the theory in the world, and it doesn't talk to us. So now that we understand a little bit about what these two worlds are in human terms, let's understand a little bit how these two worlds work in divine terms. And only after that can we circle back to Das, which we're going to discover is the bridge between these worlds. So in divine terms, we have a major issue with where we are compared to where Hashem is. Now, you've got to be careful how you say that, right? What are we saying? That Hashem is distant, that Hashem is, inaccessible? What do we mean? So let's understand it this way. When Hashem created the world, what was the first thing he created? Light. Vayomer Elokim yehi oir, vayehi oir. The first thing Hashem created was light. Now, there are many properties of light, and all of those properties are useful for us to understand divine energy. One of the properties of light is, if it's too bright and intense, then it's actually counterproductive. Blinding light. So what kind of light did Hashem originally create? Was it calibrated light? Was it unbounded light? Isn't that crazy? As I said, did you see that? The sun literally came out. As I said that, you cannot script this. That is amazing. That's like Hashem has just endorsed our shir. Showing us the light, exactly. So, what kind of light was it right at the beginning of creation? Was it... what does that mean? Oraganus? What does that mean?
There was no sun then.
There was no sun, yes. But what does oraganus mean?
It was the blinding light, I suppose, but not the light that was...
So what is, just first the expression, what does oraganus mean?
Restraint.
Not hidden light. What does oraganus mean? No. No, oraganus means the light that was thereafter hidden. Thereafter, it was hidden. In other words, Hashem said, we're told this very clearly. Chazal tell us that Hashem created light at the beginning of creation. And then Hashem decided that the world was not worthy of that light. So therefore he hid it away. Gonzoi letzadikim le'asid lavai. He hid it for the tzadikim for the future. In others in time of Mashiach. And thereafter it became known as Or Haganus, the light that once was revealed and subsequently was hidden. What do you think it means that Hashem hid the light? And let's just take this question from a perspective that I think we hopefully can all relate to, which is, do you honestly think that Hashem was experimenting? Okay, let's see how much light we should put in this world. No, that's a bit too much. Okay, we're going to... Honestly, what's going on over here? Does Hashem not anticipate in advance exactly how it's supposed to work? So what does it mean, Or Haganus? What does it mean that the light was hidden? Well, Hashem shone the light, Vayehi Or, then he hid it away. Where did he hide it? So yes, Chazal tell us he hid it in the Torah. But okay, but what does it mean? What does it mean he hid it? He didn't hide the light.
I think that's where vision comes in.
So what does it mean?
No, he means that there was people who wouldn't be able to too much.
So did he not know that was going to happen? Did Hashem not anticipate that it was going to be too much for, it doesn't say for people, it says for the world. Could Hashem not anticipate that? Obviously he anticipated that. So what does this mean?
When he wanted to show it first.
When did he hide
To who? Number one, nobody was there. Number two, if they were there, they couldn't handle it. So who's he showing it to? To himself? He hid it before everything. He hid it before everything, even before the Malachim, before everything.
That we Hashem gave us the commandments, it was too much.
Too much? Okay, you could ask a similar question, right? Did Hashem not know it was going to blow our brains out to say the first two Dibros, right? It's a similar question, 100%. And of course he wanted to. Exactly.
That was his plan.
Okay, so then why show it and then hide it? So there are many questions like this, by the way. We have a similar question with the moon. Similar question. First, Hashem creates the moon to shine. Then Hashem says, actually, it's not a good idea, but he kind of blames the moon for it, that the moon says we can't have two kings sharing the same crown. Now, instead of Hashem saying, yes, you can, because that's how I designed it, he says, fine, stop shining. What kind of a story is that? And then he tells us we have to bring a korban chatas every single Rosh Chodesh to fix that. I mean, what on earth is going on? Subject for another shir. But in this particular case, so imagine for a second, let's go back to our example of the prism. Imagine, what's that?
Hashem creates the antidote before the...
The antidote, yes, but this is more than an antidote. This is revelation. So let's go back to our prism. If I shine a light through a prism and now I get a rainbow. Now imagine that the prism is not some little thing in a science experiment in a grade 4 classroom. Imagine that the prism is the size of the universe. Now, depending on which side of this prism you're on, will determine if you're seeing light or colors. The colors are light, but you're not seeing the light because it's been refracted, because it's been de-intensified, right? It's been calibrated. So Hashem doesn't hide the light somewhere else. Instead, Hashem refracts the light into lights, in the plural, that allow existence. Now, like I said, we're going to jump back and forth between the divine example and the human example. Let's go back to the human example for a moment. Let's say that a human being walks into this room and they happen to be an incredible genius. And they're going to speak to us today about the latest advances in genetic engineering and basically convince us that we're all going to live forever because of these new advances, which is great. We all want to hear. That's why we came, because the topic was, you will live forever. So that's why we came. And then they get up, and instead of telling us all these wonderful promises about the future, they get into the deep tech of how genetic engineering works. That light will blind us. You're not going to be able to follow. We don't have a background in science or bioscience or genetics. It's too much. It's overwhelmed. We're not going to be able to understand. Now, the same person walks in here. And decides that instead of just presenting information as they see it, with the clarity they have, as bright as it is in their minds, the lights are on in their minds, instead they decide they're going to give us a little bit of a rainbow, which means they're going to pick out a few points that are relatable points about genetics, with a few examples at a level that we can understand and process. We're going to walk out of here saying, wow, that's the most intriguing thing I've heard. This turns all the medicine that we know on its head. This is brilliant. We'll be completely inspired. But will we get the light that they have? Definitely not. Will we have the insight that they have? Definitely not. Will we have the knowledge of the subject that they have? Not a chance. So the light will be there and it will be invisible at the same time. Moichin is where the light is clear, meaning the message is clear, the message is unadulterated. Midos is where the message starts to become relatable and inevitably a little less pristine, because now it's my resonance with the idea rather than the idea. So when Hashem creates the world, how does Hashem create the world? How many days does Hashem use to create the world? Not 10. Doesn't use 10 days.
6.
Right? 6 days and a 7th day of rest. Not 10. But we're talking about the fact that the world is created on a template of 10. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us Ba'asora ma'amoros ha'olam nivra, that the world was created with 10 statements. And we've been speaking again and again and again about the fact that there are 10 sephiros. So if there are 10 sephiros, why are there only 7 days in the creation process? Because 3, the moichin, are the other side of the prism. Is that what you were going to say? Right? Right? They're on the other side of the prism. They are the light and clarity of how Hashem sees existence, and we experience how Hashem has calibrated existence for us, so that it doesn't overwhelm us and it doesn't destroy us and it's not too intense, and it's not overwhelming. And of course, there is a downside to it. The downside is that Hashem is not visible, and as a result of that, our behavior is not always aligned with what Hashem wants, etc. We'll still talk about, all the negative that could come as a result. But the point is that in order for Hashem to create a world, he has to allow the possibility of a perspective that is not only the emes, not only the absolute truth as he sees it. Obviously, as Hashem sees it, is the ultimate truth. So if we had to say it, we could say this. The world of Moichin in the divine creative process is the world of light. It's just that the light presents differently if it's in Keser, or in Chochmah, or in Bina, but it's all the light. So at Keser, the light is at a level that is beyond grasp. It's the, so to speak, deepest, most profound, greatest source of light. At the Chochmah level, the light is a flash of inspiration that's come into existence, or in human experiences, come into our minds. That's why we often say, light bulb moment. Right? The light has entered my space. At the Bina level, the light has now taken on form. It's still the light, meaning I have more detail and more information, but it's still objectively true information. That's what Bina is. So in the divine process of creation, at the Bina level, there's still absolute godliness. There's no sense of self. There's no sense of we exist and now we have to decide, are we supposed to do what Hashem wants or not? At the Bina level, there's only Hashem, and this is just the information in detail about Hashem. But the minute you get into the world of Midos, well, now things start to have hues and tones and colors and perspective and uniqueness and nuance, because now Hashem is allowing a world to develop a sense of identity. This is not just about the light. This is also about viewers of light. This is not just about the truth. This is about understanders or pursuers of truth. So if we had to summarize, the world of Moichin is a world of objective truth, objective clarity. The world of Midos is the world of individuated perspectives and resonance. Moichin is as it is, Midos are as we are. All growth happens in the Midos quadrant. That's where we grow. We grow in the Midos quadrant. That's how we develop ourselves as people. We refine our character. We improve our behavior, etc., etc. All happens in the Midos quadrant. But how do we get to grow in the Midos quadrant? We have to pull information from Moichin into Midos. So let's go back to our guy at the beginning of the conversation, who's given his whole elaborate presentation about smoking, but still smokes. That means he's got the Moichin. He hasn't yet worked out how to drag it across into the field of Midos. So he's stuck. The bridge between the two is Da'as. And we still have to understand what Da'as is, but at least now we know where it belongs and what it is intended to achieve. So with that bit of information, that way of introduction, we can, please God, next week, have a look at what Da'as actually is, how it works, how we can access it, and then maybe even address some of those questions, why it's called the tree of Da'as, why intimacy is referred to as Da'as, why distraction is called lack of Da'as, and why children don't yet have Da'as. So all of that will obviously fall into place once we have a working definition for what Da'as is.
Thank you.